Welcome to the Darkstream. Voxday, voxday.blogspot.com, and Infogalactic News. We're talking about some stuff on the blog today, and specifically we're talking about an article by the Z-Man where he was talking about how incredibly stupid it was of a libertarian like Nick Gillespie to be trying to blame the current problems in France on the left-wing policies of the elite French leadership. Now, that's not to say that the left-wing policies of the elite French leadership are not deleterious and have not caused significant problems for the French people and in France in general. But what this discussion spawned was some people popping up and arguing that, well, this isn't fair, this isn't right, this isn't the just because one libertarian happens to say this doesn't mean that is necessarily a libertarian position. But that's false, because I'm not only a former libertarian, I'm someone who was regularly listed as one of the top 25 libertarians on the internet. I was one of the only nationally syndicated libertarian columnists. My column was too libertarian for the new mainstream editors everywhere from the St. Paul Pioneer Press to the Boston Globe and the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and other newspapers that my work appeared regularly in. Now, understand, I still like the libertarian ideals. They still appeal to me very greatly. If I were given my choice of a political system to theoretically apply in a optimal Panglossian world, I would definitely choose a libertarian society. I like to be left alone. I like to leave other people alone. Not terribly concerned about what other people do. For better or for worse, that's how I am. I've often said in the past that I'm libertarian down to the bone. It is my natural inclination. But just because it's my natural inclination does not mean that it's correct or that it is a sound basis for real world policy. And one of the reasons why libertarianism has been popular and has stuck around for so long is because it never got tested. There was never really much of an opportunity to test out a lot of the various elements of the theory. So what's changed? Now, I always understood, I was never a capital L libertarian. I always understood that there was fundamentally a problem at the borders. Most people don't travel that much. Or if they travel, they go and they spend a week in London and a week in Paris. They do the tourist thing. But when you've actually lived in another country, when you've actually lived in another culture, especially one where a different language is spoken, you start to understand that the whole idea of, oh, we're all really the same and everyone really wants to be an American and that sort of thing isn't even remotely true. There's times when you're in a place like Japan or Italy where you're just thinking, my goodness, am I in a different planet? Are these people aliens or what? And so, I always knew that libertarianism was not something that could be a universal policy. And so, for me, I used to describe myself as either a Christian libertarian or a nationalist libertarian. Those were always two caveats that I had. But it wasn't until relatively recently, it wasn't until I began, the whole migrant surge began here in Europe, and I started paying closer attention to what was happening in the United States, that I realized that it was hopeless. It was hapless. And let me explain why. Libertarian doctrine states that every individual has the right to travel wherever they want, that any restriction on their movement, on their immigration, on their emigration is immoral, is an illegitimate use of the state's force, and so forth. And what I began to understand more, especially when we started talking about free trade, and I started seeing how libertarian economists in particular would really start dancing around these questions, and they would claim to be making economic arguments, but they were really making moral arguments, and that these moral arguments couldn't just apply to the movement of goods and services, but also had to apply to the movement of people as well. And what became very clear through the course of them making these moral arguments was that they do not recognize nations. They intrinsically confuse the state with the nation, and they are constantly saying that the state does not exist, and they ignore that they conflate it with the nation. And so basically what they're saying is that the nation does not exist, and the nation has no rights, and so forth. And so, look, don't just mention names, okay? That they're not magic. Rothbard was wrong about a number of things. Hans Hop does not have the magical answer that will solve everything if everyone just listens to him. And so, but here's the fundamental problem, and here's why libertarianism is functionally dead. It's because what the problem with the open borders issue reveals is that essentially libertarianism cannot recognize any limit on the individual. So basically what it is a total fantasy. It's the reverse fantasy of communism. Communism is the fantasy based on the idea that class interests are supreme. But they're not. And every mistake that they make fundamentally stems from that falsehood. And in the same way, the libertarians have based their entire thinking on a falsehood, which is the absolute and utter sovereignty of the individual. Now, we can make a moral argument about the individual conscience being sovereign, but we can't do so about the individual themselves. And so, because we have to do so would be to necessarily deny the existence and the legitimacy of the family, deny the existence and legitimacy of the nation. And it is not functional. No, that's incorrect. Individuals do not create culture, which creates nations. You have it backwards. The nation comes before the nation comes before the individual. The family comes before the individual in any sort of actual society. And so, now we're not saying that we have all the answers here, but what we're saying is that we see and identify falsehoods. And so, but all the family really, all the nation really is the maximum extension of the family. And that's why the nation state, or really the multinational state, intrinsically fails, because what they're basically trying to do is put too many people together and pretend that multiple families are one. It doesn't work that way because people are not willing to sacrifice for that. And so this is why, whether they realize it or not, libertarianism is a utopian ideology. It's not a functional political philosophy. It will never be a functional political philosophy because its logic is intrinsically false. It doesn't matter how much we like the sound of it. It doesn't matter how much it appeals to us. Yes, the alt-right is exactly what I describe. That the form of the alt-right that I describe is first and foremost based on this is possible, this is practical, this is real. That is part of my, you can argue whether it should be called alt-right or not. I mean, to me, all alt-right really means is it is an aspect of right-wing political philosophy that does not fit into mainstream conservatism, mainstream libertarianism. It is outside the mainstream right-wing thought at this time. And so, what eventually, but see, that's a foolish thing. Do you also reject geometry because racists might use it to correctly calculate triangles? The truth is the truth. Reality is reality. You can reject gravity all you like because, there's a bad person somewhere who recognizes that gravity is real. So, the important thing to understand is that, I'm trying to figure out what my beliefs are now. We all are, I think that but no, libertarian hasn't changed. That's the thing. Libertarian, yes, the people who are pushing libertarianism have certainly changed in some ways. But the problem is within the ideology itself. Yes, there are issues with the people too. Alt-West is part of the alt-right. I consider the alt-right to be the broad spectrum. So, I'm not defending. I haven't even talked. See, again, you're making the same mistake. You're confusing the state with the nation. I don't have to argue for the existence of the nation. It exists. I don't have to argue for the legitimacy of the nation. The nations, they exist. When you're talking about libertarianism, when you're talking about libertarianism, no, the nation is not the culture. The nation is the people. The culture is something that the nation has. And so, what has changed about libertarianism is its public face. Its public face is now much more driven by the left libertarians, and to a certain extent, the fake libertarians who just basically want to legalize pot and they don't really care about anything else. No, there will again. You guys do not seem to. Some of you seem to have trouble understanding. The state deals with power. The nation is the collection of people. The nation of the U.S. cannot be saved because there is no U.S. nation anymore. So, what is the role of the nation in engineering the actions of the individual? Well, that's the big question. Right now, there is no coherent ideology that is based on that. There's no coherent ideology that is based on the legitimate concept of the nation. Because we've been so caught up for all this time in the concept of the limits of the state. And so, Well, I mean, I think that the nation, to the extent that the state can be legitimized, it has to be legitimized by the nation. So, there is always going to be some need. Sorry, I've got a dog. Out! I've got a dog wandering around my feet here. So we're in a very interesting time. We're in a fascinating time from an intellectual perspective, because we have to develop new concepts. We have to take this political philosophy we've got that functions and is real. And yes, I mean, there obviously the state is the most obvious implication of a nation, but it's not the only one. And so, we identify with our families, whether we put a name to it or not. And so, but the one thing that we do know about the alt-right is that it has to be nationalist in order for it to be functional, credible, viable, and meaningful. Because it stands initially, a lot of things come into being out of opposition to something else. And so what the alt-right fundamentally exists to do is to oppose globalism, to oppose multiculturalism. And what is the great enemy of globalism and multiculturalism? It's nationalism. So, so anyhow, the point is that that there's nothing wrong with the appeal of libertarianism. It still appeals to me. I like the idea of personal liberty. I like the idea of being free to make my own decisions and so forth. I fully understand why people might not want to identify very closely with their family or with their nation or those sort of things. And so, but the problem is ultimately identity drives culture, and identity is derived from your nation. And so, but it doesn't matter if a Filipino identifies as a nation. I can identify as an Eskimo. It doesn't make me an Eskimo. And so the civic nationalism, that's a different subject. Civic nationalism is also defunct. But I mean, nothing is the end game. This is a discussion and a debate that will who knows how long it will continue. We're not. No, it doesn't. No, we're not. You need to stop making comments, or I'm going to block you, because this is not all about figuring out how you can get all the answers that you want. Okay, there's 100 other people on here, so please stop trying to dominate the comments. But so we're talking about libertarianism, not civic nationalism, and so the key thing to understand is that libertarianism is a wonderful ideal. It is a appealing dream, but it is not a viable ideology, and it is not a coherent political philosophy that anyone who is cognizant of events in the world of the last 20 years or so can adhere to. And I say that, again, as someone who was previously recognized as one of the leading internet libertarians. So I'm not embarrassed. I'm not embarrassed by my past thoughts on the matter. I'm not, for me it's actually very exciting to think that, okay, look, we know that everything on the left is pretty much all of it. We know that conservatism is hopeless. And now we know that libertarianism is a non-starter too. That's why you're seeing, like somebody commented about Jeff Tucker going full SJW. That was inevitable because he now knows, he has figured out on his own that libertarianism is a non-starter. Well, I mean, but what you're talking about is not, would you agree to a closed borders protection? I mean, you know, that's just doing what the left does and trying to figure out, okay, how do we make this thing that doesn't work? It doesn't. It doesn't work. Stop worrying about it. What you should worry about is how do we maximize human liberty in a society that recognizes the world as the way it actually functions. So, anyhow, that's all I have to say, so thanks for stopping by. I should mention, since I'm wearing my Castelia House shirt, we just released a new book. It's very cool. It's called No Gods, Only Daemons, and it's written by Kai Chia, and it's supernatural military science fiction, very wild, over the top. If you like Larry Correa, if you like that, you know, lots of action and lots of explosion, you'll enjoy it. And yes, that was one of our many dogs. So have a good evening, and we'll see you soon.